We are in maple season and coming to the end of maple season. We are excited because today you have the opportunity to get to meet Mr. Aaron Wightman, and he is the co-director of the Cornell Maple Research Program. And we are going to learn about his job today. We are going to learn about the process of making maple syrup from maple sap and all the technology and tools that go into that, along with talking about what else can you make from maple syrup. So it is my pleasure to welcome you. I want to give you one big reminder. We love your questions. Please use the Q&A box anytime during our field trip today to put in your questions, burning questions. We are going to try to get to as many as we can, but we love when you ask questions, and we will pass them along to Mr. Wightman. So with that, Aaron Wightman, would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about where we are today?
Hi, everyone, and welcome. So I am the statewide maple specialist and the co-director of the Cornell Maple Program, which is within the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment at Cornell University, which is New York State's land-grant university, which is located just up the road, about 30 minutes away by car. And I am standing here today at the Arnot Maple Lab within the Arnot Teaching and Research Forest. So this is a 4,300 acre forest behind us. It's the main research forest for Cornell University. And there's a wide variety of research taking place here, looking at everything from wildlife to soil chemistry to forest management, but also maple syrup production. It's one of our 2 research facilities. The other one is in Lake Placid in the Adirondacks. But here at the Arnot Maple Lab, we're tapping about 6,000 trees, and we're doing all kinds of research in the maple lab here behind us. Our sugar bush is about 430 of those 4,300 acres, so we're taking up a good chunk of it, but not all of it. And there's lots of exciting things happening here.
Wonderful. Could you tell us a little bit about what kind of work it takes to tap 6,000 trees? How do you do that?
Yeah, so 6,000 trees is a lot to tap, but first we have to install a system to collect all that sap. So what you're seeing behind you is some of our tubing system. So we use tubes that go into the wood, so it's plastic tubing that attach to every single one of those trees. And we actually have 8,000 trees on the system. We could tap that many if we wanted to. And that's about 60 miles of tubing that we put into the woods that we have to install and then maintain. So that's a lot of work. But then when we actually go out and tap the trees, tapping is just the process of drilling a hole in the tree with a drill and tapping in a little spout to collect the sap. That takes us anywhere from 2 weeks to a month.
And do you have to do that? What time of the year do you do that? Do you do that in the summer? Do you do that right before maple season starts?
So maple season takes place in the late winter and early spring. So we need the trees to be dormant. So their leaves need to be off and it needs to be cold out. Typically here, we start tapping our trees the first week of January, and we're done by about the end of January. And anytime after that, if the sap's flowing, we can make syrup.
And what types of temperatures do trees like to be able to produce sap?
So in order for sap to have good sugar in it and for it to flow, we need to get into that time of year where we have freezing temperatures some of the time, and then temperatures above freezing other times. So when trees freeze, during that process of freezing, they actually suck water up into the trunk of the tree to fill their xylem or the tissues that hold the sap with water. And then when it warms up, the tree pressurizes. It's kind of like a soda bottle. If you shake it up, if you shook it up and then poked a hole in the bottle, the soda would come spraying out. The trees are doing kind of the same thing, so that when it's cold and then it warms up, the sap pressurizes in the tree. We can drill a hole and the sap will flow out of the tree and we can collect it and make syrup from it.
Wow. Could you tell us, as the sap is coming into that tubing, where does it end up?
So the sap all flows down the hill through the tubing all the way to our sugar house. So all the sap comes to us. We don't have to go out in the woods and gather it from buckets. We just wait for it to come to the sugar house. Once it comes to the sugar house, it goes through a little collection container that pumps it into our sap storage tanks. And we're going to walk back there right now so you can see some of our tanks. We have about 16,000 gallons of storage capacity here. We try to have at least 2 gallons of storage capacity for every tree that we tap, because during a good sap run, we could get as much as 2 gallons of sap per tap. So we have to be ready for that. Now, instead of having a couple of big we have a bunch of smaller tanks here. Each one of these tanks that you're seeing is 2,000 gallons. And we do that so that we can separate the sap into batches to do research, to do experiments, because that's what this forest is all about, is doing research.
Well, we have a great question, but I'm going to ask our cameraman, Mr. Best, to move his finger from the camera, from the lens, because it's getting in the way a little bit. But Mrs. Shell's fourth grade class wants to know, and Ellie specifically, how long does it take to grow a tree that you can collect sap from?
So maple trees, in order to be tapped sustainably, meaning that we can do it year after year, need to be at least 10 inches in diameter. So that's the size of the trunk, 10 inches around. It's about that big, 10 to 12 inches. If you're in a place where trees grow slower, it's better to let them get a little bigger. And that takes 40 to 50 years. Maple trees aren't the fastest growing species. They're about medium to medium slow. So 40 to 50 years before you can tap a tree. So the trees that you see here in our sugar bush have grown naturally, and then people came in later when they were already mature and tapped them. If you wanted to grow your own sugar bush from scratch and you were planting trees, you'd have to wait a long time before you could tap those trees.
And another great question is, how long does it take the sap to move through the tubes?
Oh, that's a great question. Our tubing network is huge. There's 60 miles of tubes in the woods, and some of the places in our sugar bush are almost 4 miles from the sugar house. And the sap might not get here the same day that it leaves the tree, depending on how long the sap flows. Sometimes it only warms up enough for the sap to flow for a little while every day. And we think some of our sap actually can take multiple days before it gets to the sugar house. But if the sap's running really hard, it probably takes an hour or less for most parts of our sugar bush to get to the sugar house.
I think this is a great question that'll help us transition into talking about your research and research projects. We have a classroom that wants to know, is climate change affecting your maple season?
Oh, climate change is a huge topic in maple syrup production right now because everything we do in the woods that allows us to get syrup depends on the right climate conditions. If it's too warm, the trees stop flowing because bacteria get into the holes that we drill in the trees and clog it all up, so we can't get any more sap. And if it's warm enough, the trees will actually start waking up, and that changes the flavor of the sap, and we can't make maple syrup out of it anymore. And this year, we actually stopped making syrup way earlier than we ever have in the past because the temperatures got too warm. So climate change is a big topic, and it's something that we're researching at Cornell to find ways to keep making maple syrup even though the climate's getting warmer.
Great, thanks. That's a great question. And so, Mr. Whitman, could you tell us a little bit about what you have set up on the table over there?
Yeah, so part of what we do, as I mentioned here, is research at Cornell. And that means we're investigating questions that people have, either problems that they experience when they're trying to make maple syrup, and we try to find a solution. Or we also look at better ways to make maple syrup. So technology to get more sap out of the tree and make better quality maple syrup. And one thing I'm testing this year are these new spouts. So the spout is the part of the tubing that actually connects to the tree. So this part right here goes in the tap hole, and it's the first part the sap encounters when it enters our collection system. And this is our standard spout that we use. And these new spouts came out of a curve in them. And the person that invented them was a researcher at the University of Vermont. His theory was that if there's a curve in the spout, the sap can flow more easily out of the tree. So in order to test whether that was true, we did a test. So we tapped a bunch of trees with the regular spout, and then we tapped a lot of trees with these two different styles of these new spouts. And then we measured how much sap came out of them every time the sap ran throughout the season. And since our season ended here, I actually already have the data. So I entered that data in my notebooks, put it into my computer, and then I analyzed the data. That means I did some special math called statistics, where we could figure out if those new spouts actually did better or not. And I have on the table here a graph for you. So this graph shows the results. It's a representation of the results. So one of the experimental spouts actually did way better. So the control, our normal spout that we use, is represented by this line down here. And it made enough sap to make just over a half gallon of syrup per tap. The experimental spouts, one of them was 22% better, and the other one did 74% better. So the spouts actually did a lot better, just like they were predicted to do. But because this is science, we need to be really rigorous. We need to test it really well before we can make any determination. So we'll keep doing this test for a few more years. And my colleague who runs our Adirondack Research Station is doing the same test. And once we have a few years worth of data, we'll be able to draw some valid conclusions. Then maple producers, if they want to use that spout, will have good information to make their decisions with.
Really interesting. Thank you very much. We have some questions, a lot of questions related to SAP. And Mrs. Shell's fourth grade class, Julia, would like to know how much SAP is collected each year from your this year from your 6,000 taps.
We collect anywhere from 100,000 to 150,000 gallons of sap every year. It varies quite a lot, and the amount of syrup we can make from that varies a lot based on how much sugar is in the sap. Some years there's a lot of sugar in the sap, other years there's not as much. So if there's a lot of sugar in the sap, it doesn't take as much sap to make a gallon of syrup. Other years there's not so much sugar, so it takes a lot more work to make a gallon of syrup from the sap that we get.
Southampton School on Long Island wants to know, how long have you been researching on this property?
So research has been taking place at the Arnot Forest at Cornell since at least the 1950s. We don't have a lot of records going back before that, but some of the technology that we use today, some of the earliest research related to that technology actually happened here in the 1950s. So things like vacuum systems. So we actually use a vacuum pump to get more sap from our tubing in the woods. That's something that was researched partially at Cornell. We have other technology that helps us concentrate our sap and things like that. That was all researched here at Cornell in the 1950s. And research has been happening continuously at Cornell for at least 60 or 70 years.
Wow. So now that we've seen the lines coming in from the woods, we've seen the tanks, what happens next?
So once we have sap in the tanks, it can sit there for a while, but usually not too long. Hopefully within the same day, we're able to process it. So what you're seeing right now on the camera is where the sap comes into the building. We didn't get to see that earlier. You can see there's a little bit coming in today, even though we're basically done for the season. Our trees are still tapped. We still have the vacuum pumps on, and it will flow into that little gizmo there. It's called the sap extractor or releaser, pumped out to the tanks. And then the next step is where we do most of the work of converting sap into syrup. And it's not actually the cooking phase. It's something called reverse osmosis. These are the machines that remove most of the water from the sap, because when sap comes in from the woods, it has very little sugar in it. But maple syrup is mostly sugar. So the first step in the process is to remove a bunch of water. And we do that with these machines. They're called reverse osmosis machines. So these machines behind me right here, these are reverse osmosis machines. That name might sound a little complicated, reverse osmosis. What in the world is that? Well, it's pretty simple. Basically, these are pumps that pump the sap under really high pressure through a filter that has holes so small that only water can pass through the filter. So it squeezes the water out of the sap. Now the filter is called a membrane, and this is actually one of the sap filters, or the filters that squeezes the water out. So what you see there is a bunch of layers of a plastic, and if I rolled it out, it would just look like a sheet of plastic, but it has really small microscopic holes that are just big enough to let a water molecule through. And that's what does the concentrating of the sap. So these machines can each squeeze about 1,000 gallons of water out of the sap every hour. And they do it very efficiently using electricity. It would take a long time to remove that much water by boiling the sap, and these can do it really fast.
So we do have a few questions, and please put, if you have other reverse osmosis questions, please put them in the chat. We have a question from the Newfield, 5th grade. How much syrup have you made this year, or will you make this year?
Well, hello, Newfield. We're your neighbors just down the road. I drove through Newfield on my way here. But that's a great question. Potentially, at the Arnot Forest with 6,000 trees tapped, if we did everything exactly right, we could maybe make up to 3,000 gallons of syrup. But because we're busy doing other things related to research, we don't always have time to focus on just producing syrup. So we hope to make about 2,000 gallons a year. Because this year ended a little early, the season ended early because it warmed up early. We came a little short of that goal, and we made about 1,800 gallons of syrup. But we make about 2,000 gallons every year. Now, at our sister station up in the Adirondacks, where they tap about the same number of trees, they usually make quite a bit more syrup than us, close to 3,000 gallons, just because the weather's better there for syrup production, and they have newer equipment, bigger equipment. So between the two stations, Cornell makes about 5,000 gallons of maple syrup every year.
Now here, as we stand with the reverse osmosis system, you get this sugar concentrate, but then you have a really pure water that comes from the system as a byproduct. What do you do with that really pure water?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we are making all this water, and in some ways it's just water. It's pure water. There's nothing else in it, but it does have the special attribute of coming from trees. And a lot of people like that. And so some companies have actually taken the water and bottled it and sold it as maple water. It's not sap, it's just water. But customers might like to drink that because it came through a tree, and that gives it some special value to them. Here at the Arnot Forest, we're making a lot of water every day, and we keep about 4,000 gallons of that water every day, and we use it for cleaning at the end of the day. So these machines need to be washed and rinsed at the end of every day, and we use the water for that. But most of the water we just pump back to the woods, and it soaks back into the ground, and it can come back to the sugar house in the form of more sap in the future.
Mrs. Roberson's class has a great question. How much time does the reverse osmosis machine take off from the total boiling time?
Yeah, so this removes about 80% of the water that we need to remove to get to finished syrup. So that reduces our time requirement by about 80%. Because these machines, we can turn them on and walk away and do other things and do other work in the woods, and they can run on their own safely and efficiently. If we were trying to boil all that water out, we would have to stand at our evaporators because they have an open fire under them. And if we left those unattended, we could actually burn down the building. It could be dangerous. So this saves about 80% of the time for us that it takes to produce maple syrup. So it's a great technology. It saves energy, and it saves time, and it saves money.
Great. So after you have that sugar concentrate, what happens next?
Yeah, so the next part of the operation after concentration with the reverse osmosis is we send the concentrated sap through these green pipes that you can see on the wall and out to our evaporators. Now, evaporators are these big, shiny metal machines you're going to see in a moment. And all they are is giant cooking machines. They're designed to boil water very efficiently in large volumes and finish that syrup down. So there's still a lot of water we need to remove, even though the RO did most of it, the reverse osmosis machine. So the next step is evaporation here. So I'm going to step around here in just a moment and kind of walk you through how these machines work. And here's a couple of our crew here at the Arnot Forest making syrup right now. But as you can see, these green pipes end right here at these tanks. These are our feeder tanks where the concentrated sap is collected, and then it flows into our evaporator through these pipelines. So the sap's flowing in here, and the first stop in these evaporators is what's called a steam pan. It's a special kind of pan where the sap gets warmed up before we boil it. So when the sap comes out of the woods, even after it's processed through reverse osmosis, it's usually only about 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty cold. And one way we can warm it up is to put it in this pan up here, and the steam from the boiling sap below it actually passes by that sap and warms it up. So without spending any extra money or energy, we preheat the sap so that it's ready for the boiler. So it starts out in the top part, and then it flows through this silver pipe that you see here. The sap flows down to this part. And this is called a float box. So it just has a little floating valve. So every time I push down on this, you'll see that more sap can come in. So anytime the sap level gets lower because we're boiling some of the water away, the float sinks a little bit and allows some sap in. So the sap will flow from the warming pan into this big part down below. This is called a flue pan. This is where most of the boiling takes place. The bottom of the pan is shaped with crinkles like this. And what that does is it increases the amount of surface area that the fire, which is down here, can contact. So it can transfer more heat from the fire into the sap and we get a really strong air. So this is boiling like crazy in there, making a lot of steam that's going up and out through the roof through some stacks. After the sap is finished in there, it goes through another float box and it goes into what's called the front pan of this evaporator. And we can walk around and take a look in there. Oh, there's a draw right now coming out. That's what the syrup looks like when it comes out. That's a little tool we use to measure the density. That's pretty dense syrup. That's also very dark syrup. At the end of the season, we make the darkest syrup.
And does
So
that have a different flavor, Mr. Whitman?
yes, the darker it is, the more intense the flavor it is. And the syrup we're making right now is actually not even grade A. We could not even put that in a bottle because the flavor is so strong. We'll put it in a barrel instead and sell it to someone who will use it to flavor other foods. You can see a little bit of what's happening in the flue pan there where the heavy boil is happening. And then you can see the temperature gauge is pretty hot in there. We're boiling at close to 220 degrees, and that's our finishing temperature today is 220.7 degrees. And then up here, you can see where the syrup is coming in and getting finished. It's flowing in through these pans and out at the far end.
So what does it mean to finish? It's already reached the 220-degree mark where it's considered, where it's finished its cooking process. And what does the finishing pan do?
So that's where it gets to the final exact temperature where it has the exact right amount of sugar in it and water that it's done. And then we can circle around to the other side of the evaporator and you can see some of the other technology we use here. So the way we decide to pull syrup out of the evaporator is first by determining the finish temperature, but instead of having to stand here and open and close valves all day, we actually program this little device. It's a control unit where we set our finish temperature. Actually, it's 221.1 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a little temperature probe that goes into our syrup. And when it measures that finishing temperature on this device, it automatically opens this valve here and lets the syrup out into our draw pan. So the syrup will just keep flowing in here whenever it's ready. And then when we want to filter it, we'll dump in some of this powder. This is called diatomaceous earth. It helps us filter any impurities out of the syrup. We just mix it in. And then we don't have it hooked up quite yet, but if we had this hooked up, we would pump it through what's called a filter press. This is the way we clean up the syrup, is with a device like this. And all it is a series of little plates. There's two different kinds in here. And we slide these filter papers in between each one of these, and we pump the syrup through. And it has a really fine filter that will filter everything out, including all kinds of minerals and other impurities that we don't want in our syrup. And it comes out crystal clear. Then we can put it in a barrel. So what you see here next to us is one of our barrels of finished syrup. We barrel it 40 gallons at a time. And if we put it in there nice and hot and seal it up, it can stay in that barrel without spoiling for decades.
Wow. We have an interesting question. What happens if you overboil the sap?
Yeah, so if we overboil the sap, there are two possibilities. One, we can just make it too dense, so it doesn't have quite enough sugar or quite enough water, and it has too much sugar. And it would taste fine. It'd be a little extra sticky, but if we put it in a bottle when it cooled down, some of that sugar would settle down to the bottom and form crystals on the bottom of our jug. And that's not good because it's wasting sugar, and we're actually not allowed to sell it if it's too dense like that. There are rules about what you can sell. The other possibility is if we cooked it too long in here, we could actually burn it. And if we burn syrup in our evaporator, it would actually ruin the evaporator. It would ruin some of the pans, and it's expensive to fix that. Some of those pans cost thousands of dollars. So we're very careful not to overcook the syrup. But if we overcook it just a little bit, we can always just add some water back in, and it's perfectly fine.
So I think Miss McKee's class has a great question as we transition to our next stop at your Maple Research Station is, what do you do with the syrup that you make?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Everybody knows maple syrup and loves it, or most people have tried it. That's not the only thing we can do with maple syrup. Oh, before we go in there, I just want to mention real quick, on the topic of research, I mentioned before we do research here, and that's actually the reason we have two evaporators here. So we do a lot of experiments with different ways to process maple syrup. And in order to do an experiment, you need something to compare your experiment to. So we might boil sap the normal way in this evaporator, the way people usually do, and then take some of that same sap and boil it differently and do an experiment in this other evaporator. So that's the reason that our sugar house is a little bit different, and you'll see things like two evaporators, two reverse osmosis machines, because we're doing research. Now, another type of research we're doing, back to the topic we just mentioned, is different foods that we can make out of maple syrup. So we're walking now into our research kitchen. And one of the things that's unique about the Cornell Maple program is we actually have a food scientist on our staff. So Dr. Belisle, who's not here today, would normally do research in this space. And part of her research is new products. Part of it is traditional maple products and figuring out ways to make them better. So one of the things that people do syrup and have done for years and years and years is to make what we call traditional maple confections, traditional snacks. So you can take just plain maple syrup and make a lot of different things out of it. So if you cook it a little further and then let it cool and stir it, you can make something called maple cream, which is this nice spread that you can make. The only ingredient is still maple syrup, but because we remove more of the water and then crystallize it into a cream, it's spreadable and it has intense flavor. People put it on their toast and things like that. We can cook it a little bit more dense and make these nice little maple candies. So you just cook the syrup a little longer and then pour it into molds and it hardens into these nice candies, which are delicious. Or you can cook it even 50 degrees above the boiling point of water and stir it, and it will crystallize into a nice sugary powder like this. So you don't have to do anything but cook it, let it cool, and stir it. And when you make sugar like this, it would just crystallize almost instantly after a few minutes of stirring and turns into this nice dry powder. So the way that's done requires a little bit of knowledge. A lot of people have struggled to consistently make good quality traditional maple confections. So one of the things we've done here at Cornell is we did a lot of research into all the variables or factors they need to consider to make good quality maple confections all the time. And we put all that information in this nice notebook that you can find on our website. So if you want to make a confection, like a maple sugar or maple cream, you just open the book up to the chapter that you want, and here's the granulated sugar chapter, and it tells you all the things you need to know to make a really good quality sugar all the time. Now, the other neat thing we do here, as I mentioned, is new product development. We come up with new things that you can make out of maple syrup or maple sap. So this is just a small sample of some of the products we've made. We're doing some research into skin and beauty products or bath products. So this is actually a bar of soap made with maple sugar. We have lip balm that has maple syrup in it. And we've also done some sugar scrubs and other cosmetic products, so that's fun. But most of what we do is food product development. This is a product that we just started working on. It's a maple hazelnut spread. So some of you might Nutella, which is a chocolate spread made from hazelnuts and sugar. Well, this is kind of like Nutella, but it's maple flavored. So it's got hazelnuts and maple syrup in it. It's got a few other ingredients, and it's a delicious, creamy spread. So good. We've also made this with chocolate. We've made sodas. We've made maple marshmallow spread. These are just some samples from our tests. We've made root beer, sports drinks, and all kinds of other products. And once we do all the tests to develop those new products, and we know that what the information we're providing is good and accurate, we create these fact sheets, which are available on our website for free, and it gives all the instructions for how to make a really good quality product. This fact sheet here is for maple marshmallows, and they are wonderful.
So, Mr. Wightman, are you creating these new products and best practices for these additional maple items just to see if you can? Or what do you think is the purpose of creating these new products and trying different things just because you can? Or is there another purpose?
So the mission of the Cornell Maple Program is to help maple producers sustainably make as much syrup and syrup products as possible, and then also sell them. So it generates opportunities for people to make a living making maple syrup. So we generate all these new product ideas so that people can take those ideas and make products and sell them and make money.
That's really, really interesting. Was somebody just using the example of maple sugar cakes versus maple syrup? If you took your gallon of maple syrup and made maple sugar cakes with it, do you make the same amount of money selling that gallon just as the fluid syrup, or do you make more money selling the value added product of the maple sugar cakes?
Well, it really depends a lot and a variety of factors, but in general, people tend to make more money from value added products. That's why they're called value added products or confections. So a gallon of syrup will make about 0.8 gallons of maple cream. So you end up with a little less product, but you can sell it for more money. This little jar sells for $10 at the Cornell store on campus. And you can make a lot of these jars from 1 gallon of maple syrup. So we might end up making more like $140 total sales when we make cream versus $80 for a gallon of syrup. But it costs us a little bit more to make that cream because there's extra work and extra equipment involved. But in general, we'll still make a little bit more money making these value-added products. But the other benefit is if you're a maple syrup producer and you have a little stand, for example, where you're selling your maple syrup, if someone comes to the stand, they'll syrup. But if there are other products too, different products, they might buy those as well. So they might buy multiple products and you'll sell more things overall if you have a diversity of different products to offer.
Churchville Chi Middle School wants to know, do you have someone that taste tests your products?
Oh yes, so we taste all of our maple syrup. So one of the parts of the process that we did out of the evaporator is actually grading the syrup. So when the syrup comes out of the evaporator, we have to check it for a few different things. One is density. We have to make sure it has the right amount of sugar in it. Another is color, because in New York and other states, you have to sell your syrup according to the color that it is. There are different color grades. But the last thing is flavor. We have to make sure that it has good flavor. So we're constantly tasting our maple syrup and making sure that it has the right flavor. And we can actually step over to the grading station so you can see the tools that we use. In addition to checking the flavor, the ones that measure the amount of light that passes through it or how dark the syrup is and how dense it is. So these tools here are called refractometers. There's different styles. Those measure how much sugar is in the syrup. And then there's a little tool here. That's a light transmittance meter. We put a little syrup in a glass container and put it inside, and it will tell us how light the syrup is. And then we grade it according to the chart that you see over here. There are 4 different color grades. And then, as you can see, we have a little package of paper cups here. And that's the last step in the process, is we're always dipping a little cup in the syrup and tasting it. If it has any off flavors, if it doesn't taste quite right, we can't put it in bottles and sell it. So that's really important information for us. And we write those notes in our notebook. We try to describe the flavor so that we know how good some of that syrup is. And you can see the last few that we made. I don't know if you can read the notes. They say Tootsie Roll. Tootsie Roll is a flavor descriptor that's used to describe what's called buddy syrup. It's the syrup that comes at the very end of the season when the trees are trying to grow again, when they're trying to swell their buds to grow leaves. And it's considered a flavor defect. It might sound good, Tootsie Rolls are good, but it's actually kind of sickly sweet and it's not real pleasant.
So, Mr. Wightman, looking at that chart over there of the different grades of maple syrup, which grade do you prefer on your pancakes?
I like the dark syrup because I like the strong flavors, but the best sellers are usually dark and amber. So dark and amber syrup. Those are kind of the medium grades where they have a lot of flavor, but they aren't overpowering. In the old days, people used to like the golden syrup, and that's because people used maple syrup to sweeten everything way back in the 1800s. And they got kind of tired of everything tasting like maple. So it was considered fancy if you had less flavor. But now people, when they spend extra money to get maple syrup, they want a lot of flavor. So amber and dark color are usually the most popular, but I like the very dark stuff.
So, Mr. Wightman, we have a ton of great questions that are here in the queue. I'm just going to rapid fire some questions to you until the end of our time, or try to get as many as we can in. So we have a question that wants to know, what color is the sap before it turns into maple syrup?
So maple sap, if it's nice and clear early in the year when the woods are still cold and there aren't a lot of microbes trying to grow, like bacteria in our sap, it looks like water. But later in the year, because it gets warm out and because our systems aren't sterilized, they have some bacteria and yeast in them sometimes, and it starts to get a little cloudy. And if there are a lot of red maples on the system, sometimes the sap looks a little bit green, just very slightly, but usually it looks just like water because it's mostly water. 98% of the sap is water.
We have a question. When you buy maple syrup, and I assume using it in your life, how long until it expires?
So maple syrup is very stable because there's not much water in it. Bacteria and other things that might want to spoil it can't grow in it very easily. But once you open it, if you leave it out on your counter and let it be warm for a few weeks, you usually start to get a little mold on the surface. So it's perfectly stable in here when these drums are sealed and when it's hot, and in the bottle when it's sealed. But once you open it, you need to put it in the refrigerator.
Joey from Kingston wants to know, what made you get into researching maple syrup?
Oh, that's a really interesting story. I actually grew up making maple syrup in Western New York. That was our family business that we had. And so I experienced that as a young child and always enjoyed it. And as an adult, I actually became a forester for a time. I worked with harvesting timber and things like that. And when this job came open at Cornell, I had a chance to come back to maple syrup production and do research. So it's been a lot of fun to do that.
Lillian wants to know, can you put 2 taps in one tree?
Yeah, so you can put 2 taps in one tree. And for a long time, the tapping guidelines said that if trees were over a certain size, that they should get 2 taps. Usually 18 inches around was the size for 2 taps. But now, because we use vacuum pumps to help extract sap from the tree, we usually only put 1 tap in a tree here. But if you're hanging buckets on a tree, you might want to hang 2 buckets on those bigger trees.
And we had a question. They were really interested. Does your sap ever freeze in the tubing?
Yeah, our sap freezes in the tubing all the time. And that's why we use these special materials. It's high density polyethylene is the main material we use for our plastic tubing. But another word for it is just plastic, right? It's just a fancy type of plastic that's able to expand and shrink with the ice. So the ice doesn't just break it. So it freezes in the tubing. And then when the sun shines like today, it will melt that sap and it will flow to the sugar house.
Toby wants to know, what do you do other times of the year when it's not maple syrup season?
Yeah, some people think that we just sit around and wait for the sap to flow, but because we're a research organization, we communicate with those that are around. And we also are busy maintaining our tubing network. There's 60 miles of tubing in the woods here, so we have to go out and work on that. We make changes to it every year during the summer so that we can do new research on the tubing in the winter. And we also have to maintain our sugar bush. So we have a forest here where we're doing active forestry practices to keep it growing and healthy. So we do a lot of that during the summer. Another thing we do is we do something called Maple Camp. So every year we have people come and they spend a week camping out at the forest and learning everything they need to learn to make their own maple syrup. So there's a lot of things going on all the time here at the Arnot Forest.
And I think this is a great question. This will be our last question of the day. But on that topic of forest management, one of our classrooms wants to know, has there ever been a disease or a pest that has threatened your forest or maple production?
There are a lot of things that threaten our forest all the time. There are some insects that are native, so they're natural here, that move through our forest, like forest tent caterpillars. And there are things we can do to treat the trees to protect them against that. But there are other things that are moving through the forest that are things that were brought over from other countries that our forests aren't adapted to. Emerald ash borer is the most recent one that killed all our ash trees. And we've been lucky that we haven't had any species brought from overseas that kill maple trees, but it's possible that that could happen. So that's something we're always concerned about.
Well, Mr. Wightman, we can't thank you enough for sharing your knowledge and your career in agriculture with us. We hope that you have a great end of your maple season, and we want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our classrooms across the state. We appreciate you, and thanks for being with us, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.